Hello and welcome back everyone. In today's video we are going to learn how to create this leaderboard. I've seen a lot of you having issues with the leaderboard and the UI, so I created this UI which displays the top players, and we also have this thing right here which has the score and a button. If you click on it, it increases the score and it also log it to the leaderboard. Now the score that I have is not connected to the leaderboard, so even if I get up to 100 it will not be displayed on the leaderboard, and this is because I hard-coded the leaderboard to show you how it updates every 5 seconds. So first we have three modules: the PlayerTracker, which is an empty object and it has a PlayerTracker module script. We have a UI manager, which is also an empty object that has a UI manager script. Now the UI manager script has a minigame object, which is the score that you see here, and the button. I called them minigame. And we also have the leaderboard object, which is this one right here. Now we also have utilities. This is not necessary, but I like to use it. It's an empty object and it has a utils module. It stores the function that I'm going to be using more than once. And if you go to the user interface in the hierarchy, we have a leaderboard, which is a ranking. I call the script ranking. It's a UI script, and the output is set to world because I want to display the leaderboard on the world and not on the screen. And in the mini game, we also have another UI script. I call it minigame, and it's set above chat because if I open the chat, the button goes up, and if I minimize the chat, the button goes down. So it's always visible to people to click on. Now every time again I click on the button, you can see here it is changing the value, it's changing the score, it's increasing it, and it's also storing it locally, and it's updating the leaderboard. We're gonna learn how to communicate between the scripts, how to write them, and how to set them up. But the thing about this is not related to the way I style it. I'm not gonna go through the styling. This is up to you. You can style it however you want. I'm just gonna show you the logic behind it, okay? If you want help with styling, please head to our Discord and we will explain to you, or we will help you style your UI better. In this tree example, we have 4 different scripts that communicate with each other, like we talked about before. To get and edit the data, we update the UI and store the values. First, the player tracker sends information to the UI manager. Once the UI manager receives this information, it forwards it to the leaderboard and the minigame. When we want to update the leaderboard, we request the information from the UI manager, and the same goes for the minigame. When we want to update the UI for the score, we request the information from the UI manager. Now the UI manager calls functions and sends requests to the player tracker, which updates the score locally and in the storage as well. Now this way we create a network between all scripts, allowing easy data manipulation and transfer. Even if we want to add more games or logic, we follow the same structure, if that makes sense. So this might sound a bit complicated or overwhelming, but if you repeat this video more than once, you will get it. First, in the PlayerTracker.lua, we create 2 tables, empty tables, that tracks the players and the top players. And then we create a function to track the players when they connect to the game using the game.playerConnected, and then we initialize player information with score set to 0. Now we listen to the client awake function to handle the client initialization, and we also pass in the function that we created earlier, which is the track players. So now we're tracking the players on the client awake, and we also pass this function on the server awake. So now we're tracking the players on the client and the server at the same time. Now we go back all the way to the top and we add 2 events. One to get the top players and one to send the top players. Get top players request for requesting top players list from the server, and the get top players response to receive the top players list from the server. Now in the client awake, we simply request the top players from the server when the client initializes after the track players. So get top players request to fire it to the server, and back to the server, we simply get the top players from the storage. Now if there's no top players in the storage, it will create a new table for us, and we simply override the top players table that we created earlier with the new list that's in the storage. After that's done, we requested the top players from the client. Now we have to listen to that request. So we handle the request for top players list from the client by doing get top players request.connect, and then we get the top players from the storage again. We override the top players with the old list, and then we send the top players list to the client. So we use get top players response fire all clients because we're gonna send it to all the clients, all the players that are in the game or in the world. And then we pass in the top player as an argument because we basically want to override them back into the client. So in the client awake, we again listen to the top player's response that we sent from the server, and it has the parameter or the argument that we pass, which is the top players. We override, like we said, top players equal new top players, meaning that we had an empty table before. Now we have a table full with the players that we just sent from the server. Now back to the outside the client awake and the server awake, we create a function. This function will get the top player list. So whenever we request this function, it will basically sort the table and it will return from the highest to the lowest score. And this function basically gets the top player from the server that we requested earlier. Back all the way to the top, under the events that we created, we are going to create 3 different events. Now those events will basically be related to the player itself, which is the local player. So get score request, event for requesting score from the server. Get score request, similar to the top players, it's gonna be an event for receiving score from the server, and then event for updating the score and notifying the server. It's called update score event. Again, in the client awake, when the client start, when the player joins, we basically want that score. So we request the score from the server when the client initializes using the get score request fire server. That request that we sent, we have to listen to it in the server. So we handle that request for the player score by using get score request connect, and that event takes the player, which is the local player. Now to get the player score, we have to listen to the storage.getPlayerValue, which gets the score of that specific player. Now we check if the score of the player is 0 or it doesn't exist. We basically add a 0 score to them and we update them locally because we earlier created a table called players, and then we send that response back to all the clients. But here we pass in the player because we basically want this specific player and its score. So get score response, fire all client with the player and the score as an argument. Back to the client, in the client awake, after we send that response, we have to listen to it. So we handle that response that we sent from the server containing the player and the score using get score response, and then we connect to that response that takes both player and the score. Now we basically retrieve the information of that player using the player information, and then we override the score of the player using player info.score, which overrides the score that we just got from the server. And we obviously can't print that score if we want to. Back to the top, we create functions outside. Now these functions are not local function, they are a global function which can be used in different scripts, and that's exactly why we create them outside the client awake and the server awake. So the first function to get the player information, and the second function is optional. If you want to use it, you can create a function to get the player score specifically, and the players is going to be the player.name because we're storing the players with their names, and this will return the score of that player. Again, we create another function now, and it's also a global function. It's not a local function. This can be placed outside the client awake and the server awake because we want to use this function later. So this function adds a score to the specific player. It takes the target and it also takes the score that we want to add. Now we basically ensure that the target player matches the local player because we don't want to mess anyone's score up. We have to check if this player is the target, and then we retrieve their information, and then we calculate the score by adding the previous score with the score that we're going to add. We update their information locally, and then we fire an event to update the player's score on the server. So update score event, we fire it to the server with the score that we are going to add. Back to the server, since we fired an event, we have to listen to it. So we handle the update score events from the client by using update score event connect, which takes 2 parameters, the player that sent the event and the score that we're going to add. We get the player information that's stored on the server. We again calculate the score, we add the score to the previous score that we had, and then we increase that score in the storage using the storage.increasement player value, which takes the player as a parameter, and then the key, which is the score, and then the third argument, which is the score that we are going to add. In our case, it can be anything 1, 10, 5, whatever you want. And inside that same event, we have to create an entry for that player because we want to update the top players. And that entry will be the name and the score, which is basically the player.name and the new score that we just got. Now we have to check if this player is in the top player list. So we initialize a variable, we call it found, and it's false by default. And then we check for all the players if this player.name is the same to the player that just got the score. If yes, we simply change the found to true, and if not found, we insert a new row or a new table inside the top players. Once we insert that new table, we basically send a response back to all the clients with the top players because we previously listened to the get top players response to basically update the leaderboard whenever we want to, and then we set the value or we override the value of the top players in the storage with the new top players that we have because we just added a new player to that list, if that makes sense. Now back all the way to the top where we created the function earlier. Remember when I said the global function that we're going to be using later? We are going to create another function, and this function will get the rank of that player. Since we added that player to the top players, so now we have a new value. We have to get the player information, and we have to get the player score, and this is all for the player tracker. Now we are going to explain more about the UI manager, and we're also going to explain more about how to update the top players on the leaderboard, or to see them, or to update the UI, because basically we added all the functions that we need. And again, remember, this is a module script. Everything that we created in here will be usable outside the script itself. So back to our scene, we have to create a UI manager script. Now this UI manager script is a module script. If you don't know how to create one, right click, create, Lua, and module. Once you do that, create an empty object in the hierarchy, which is, I called it UI manager, and I dragged and dropped this script that I created to the empty object that I have. Now you won't have a minigame object and a leaderboard object yet because we still haven't write any code yet, so we are about to do this right now. Now once you open the UI manager script, you have first to initialize a new variable, which is going to be a serialized field for the minigame object, as well as the leaderboard object, and then we're going to make a reference to the minigame script, the minigame scripts that's inside the minigame object, and the same goes for the leaderboard. We have to make a reference for the leaderboard script that's inside the leaderboard object, and we're also going to require the PlayerTracker module script that we created earlier in our video. Once that's done, you basically go back to the UI manager object, and you see here you have two new fields, the minigame object and the leaderboard object. We created the minigame and the leaderboard objects before, and we gave them the UI, which is ranking, and the minigame UI. Again, if you don't know how, just basically create an empty object and go here to the UIs or to the project and right click, create Lua and UI. Now the first one is called ranking, the second one is called minigame. I gave the minigame output to above chat, and the leaderboard is a world output. Now that's done, you go back to the UI manager and you select the minigame object. You click on the circle right here and you basically select that object. Same goes for the leaderboard. You select this object and you select leaderboard. That's done. We go back to our code. Now in here, we listen to the client awake, the function that handles the client initialization, as well as the client start, the function that handles the client start. In the client awake, we get the minigame script component. We check if it's nil. We basically assign that script using the minigame object get component minigame, because our UI or our script is called minigame. Same goes for the leaderboard. We get the leaderboard script component. We check if it's nil. If it's nil, we basically assign that script using the leaderboard object get component and the name of the script, which is ranking. Back to the client start, we get the player, which is the client.local player. We update their score after 3 seconds using timer.after3, which takes a function, a callback, and then we get the player information from the player tracker. Remember the module that we required before and the get player information that we created, the function that we created before. We basically update after 3 seconds the local player score in the UI. Now that we have the minigame script, we can use the update local player, which takes the score because we basically want to display that score. We will talk about this later in the video when we get to the minigame script. Now back to the top. Outside the client awake and the client start, we create a global function. I talked about the global function more than once. So the function is update score that updates the player's score, which takes the target and the score to add. We check again if the target player is not the local player like before, and then we get their current score using the same function from the player tracker module, which is get player information that takes the player as an argument. And then we check if there's no player info, we just basically return, we exit the function. We calculate the score using the player info.score since we are storing that score inside the player info, and then we add the score to them. So basically player tracker.add score. Remember the function that we created before in our player tracker, which takes the target and the score to add. This will basically store this score in the storage, and at the same time it will also update the UI. Now inside the function itself, we get that mini game script. Remember, we assigned a minigame script. We update the UI with the new score using the minigame script.update local player, which takes the new score. Again, I will talk about this in a second. Then, if you want, you can get the rank, which is I suggest because I like getting the rank. Get the player rank and update the leaderboard by doing PlayerTracker.get local player rank. Again, this is a function that we created earlier, and it's a global function that I said it can be used anywhere in our scripts. Then we update the leaderboard using leaderboard script.update local player because that's a function I created in the leaderboard script, or we are going to create, that takes the new score and the rank of the player. Now back to our scene. If you look here, I have a folder called UI inside the art. So here I have a UI folder just to keep things organized. You can do the same. Right click, create and a folder. Call this UI, and inside the UI I have a bunch of different folders. One to store the images, one to store the fonts, and the other ones are basically the UIs that we're going to create. So if you take a look at the images right here, we have backgrounds and I store the paper. You can replace this with whatever you want. And in the fonts, if you want to add a font, you basically drag and drop whatever font you want, or you download it on Google or anywhere. If you have a font, just put it right here, but you have to convert it to assets. So right click on the font itself, create, go to text, and then font asset. This way it will create font asset for you. And then if you go back to the UI folder, I have leaderboard and I have minigame, so you can create two separate folders for minigame and the leaderboard. Now inside the minigame, you right click, create, and then Lua, and then UI. You give this script or this UI a name minigame, and it will generate 3 scripts for you. The minigame.lua, minigame.uss, which is the style sheet for the UXML, and the minigame.uxml. Again, I'm not going to go through all the styling. Instead, I will just display the styling on the screen, so you can just copy them if you want, or you can just add your own styling. Now, first things first, we open the minigame.uxml. So now when you open the minigame.uxml, you're gonna see a UI Lua view that has a class minigame, which is the same name as the script name. So please do not change that. On the right side, I will display the styling if you want to copy it, but I'm not going to explain it. Now inside the minigame UI Lua view, we are going to create a new UI label, which is the score label. Now this label has a class of minigame score, and it also have a name of score label. Now the name is very important because this is how we are going to assign values or change the text using the name. And we also have a visual element which has the class minigame. This is for styling purposes only. I contain everything inside of it, and you can see the styling on the right side. Now inside the minigame game, we are going to create a UI button, which is the important part here. It takes the class secondary button, which is a secondary style in Highrise that Highrise provides for you if you want to use. And it also takes the name, which is the button that name we're going to use to handle whenever someone click on that button, and inside of it we have a label that says click me. This label will be displayed inside the button itself. Now if you go back to the minigame.lua, we have to first bind the names that we created before, which is the score label, that's a UI label, and we also have to bind the button, which is again the name of the button that we created earlier, and then we also have to require the UI manager scripts using the require UI manager scripts that we created before. Now we add a new function. This function will update the local player, which will also update the player on the screen. So whenever you call this function, it will set the text for that score label to score, and we also use toString because we want to convert the number to a string. Remember in the UI manager, we required this script, and we also use this function whenever we add a new score. We also register a callback for when the button is pressed using the button register, which is the method register press callback that takes a function, a callback. We get the local player, and then we use the UI.update score, which is player, and we only want to add 1 point. You can change one to any points you want, whatever you want, but basically the update score function that takes the player as a parameter, as a first argument, and then the score that we want to add. We talked about this before in the UI manager script. Back to our scene. In the UI folder, I created a leaderboard folder, and inside of it I created a UI called ranking. Right click, create, Lua, and then UI. Give it a name, ranking, and make sure that this is set to the world. When you go to the hierarchy here, we have a leaderboard, and we attached the script already. Just set the output to world. And the size right here really depends on your background, the image that you're using. For example, I'm using a really wide image, a really huge image, and that's why I set it to 830 by 1000, and I set the clear color to true, and you can also set the transparency to 0, just so if you're using a background, of course, you would just override the color that you have. Now if you open the ranking.txml, you're going to see the class ranking. Of course, again, do not change the name of this class. This is important. Keep the class ranking. And inside the ranking, we are going to create a visual element that holds the header, and it will give it a class header. And inside the header, we have two labels, one for the title and one for the subtitle, which is the update. We call it update, we give it the update class, and it also says updates every 5 seconds. You can change this later on if you want. You can set it to 10 seconds, whatever you want. This is just visually. And under the header inside the ranking, we create another visual element, and this is the content. It also has a name. Now this is important. The name of the content should be content, and then inside the visual element, which is the content, we have another visual element that holds the list of the ranks, which is rank list, and we also give it a name, rank list. And under the rank list inside the content, we basically create another visual element, which is called local rank, and inside the local rank we will basically set the local rank for the player to be displayed. And in the rank list, if you look at the line, it says rank items will be added here, meaning that we will dynamically generate, or we will dynamically get the players and assign a list or a rank for them. And that's what we are basically calling in the style. If you see on the right side of the screen, content rank item, even though it doesn't exist, but it will exist later on when we script our leaderboard. Now inside the local rank, we basically want the local position of the player, and that's a UI label, and it has a name, which is local position, so we can bind it later. And it also has a local name, which is also, again, can be binded, and the local score. And you can see on the right side, we have the styling for each one of them. Now in the ranking.lua, we bind the local position, the local name, and the local score, the one that we defined earlier, and we also bind the content and the rank list. We require the player tracker from the player tracker module, and we also require the utils from the utils module. Now the utils you might not have, which you might also not need, because I only have a very simple function that basically generate a position for the player, which is, it doesn't really matter. I'll explain later when we get to the point. Now under the require for the utils, we create another function, and that function is going to be a function that updates the local player score and rank, which takes the score as a first argument and then the rank as a second argument. This function we use whenever we want to update the leaderboard, for example in the UI manager or the player tracker, and we set the local name for the player, which is the player.name, and also the local score to, again, we convert it to string and we set it to the score. And then if the player has a rank, just display it. If not, you don't have to display it, just type an A. And you can see here I have something called utils.getPosition suffix, and this is the function that I'm talking about. Now this is not important, you don't have to add this. This basically just generate one. Now here we create a function called update leaderboard, which takes the player as a parameter. First, we have to clear the list that we have using rank list and clear, and if not players or the number of the players, we use hashtag players to get the number of the player. If it's 0, we just return and we end and we exit the function, and then we get the count of the players. If the count is more than 8, we only want to display 8, so we override the count with 8. And then we create a loop that loop through all the players, all the top 8 players, and then it will basically create a rank item for each one, which is a visual element, and then the rank item will give it a class rank item, and then we get the entry for each player. And you can see on the right side, this is what I'm talking about with when I say entry, because each player has its own entry and it has a name and it has a score. And obviously local name equal entry.name, local score equal entry.score. Now we get we create a new rank label, which is a UI label, and we set the text for that. Again, we use the function that I told you about. And then the rank label, we give it a class rank label. Same goes for the name and same goes for the score, and then we add them in order to the rank item. Now the rank item is holding all of them, so basically rank item add, and then rank label, name label, and then the score label. Now that's done. We check if the I, which is the position of the player or the rank of the player, is first, which is 1. We add a class list, which is first. This is styling purposes only. You don't have to do it, but I do it. And then again, we check if the second, we add the second, and third, we add third. And finally, we add the rank item that we created for each player to the rank list. Now that's done, we set a cooldown that updates every 5 seconds to 5, and we set a timer to keep track of the time. We initialize a function to update the leaderboard, self-client update, and now we keep increasing the timer, so the timer will always be equal to the timer plus time delta time, so it increases every frame. And now we check if the timer is greater or equal to the cooldown, then we get the top players using the PlayerTracker, which is the module that we required earlier, and we also created the function that gets the top players. This will return the top players, and then we update the leaderboard, or we call the function that updates the leaderboard, which takes the top players that we just got from the PlayerTracker. We also get the local player by using client local player. We get their information using the get player info, the same function that we also used before that takes the player as a parameter. We also get their score using the player info.score since we have them, and now we get their rank using the get local player rank that we also used before, which takes the player as a parameter. And then we call the function that we just created, update local player, with the score and the rank, and then we reset the timer. And this is important, you have to reset the timer every time you update something or every time the timer is done. And with that, we created this leaderboard that tracks our score every time you click on this. You can see here it updates the name, and it also updates the UI, and it waits 5 seconds to update the leaderboard. Now the leaderboard is basically the list of the players, but this one is my player, so this one will always update in real time, but this one will not. It will only wait for 5 seconds to update all the list of the player. This just to avoid extra requests and responses and events that's been firing from the client to the server and the opposite. I hope you guys enjoyed. Please let me know if you have any issues. You can always head to our Discord, highrise.gg/highrise and discord.gg/highrise, and then that's it. It's been it's a long video. I know you have to watch it again and again to understand, but again, I will always answer your questions. Let me know, and I'll see you in the next video.